I woke up before dawn, the soft hum of the heater filling the quiet house. On the small wooden table, the jewelry box sat where Ruth had left it, each piece a memory stitched into my life. Today felt different, heavier somehow. My granddaughter, Lily, had already asked for Grandma's ring, that little circle of gold that carried decades of laughter, arguments, and secrets. I found myself hesitating, my hands brushing over the familiar smooth surface, wondering if she truly understood what she was asking for. Have you ever handed something precious to someone only to realize they might never understand its meaning? I pulled the envelope from the drawer, its edges worn, and held it close. Ruth had left it for moments like this, a silent teacher for those who would come after. My heart tightened with a mix of hope and dread, knowing that this small envelope could change everything between us. And then the phone rang, breaking the fragile calm, as if the universe wanted me to confront the truth sooner than I expected. The phone call left a strange silence behind, the kind that fills a room even when nothing has changed. I sat back in my chair, clutching the envelope like it contained more than just paper, like it carried the weight of decades, of choices made and secrets kept. I thought about Lily's small, eager hands reaching for the ring, her bright eyes unaware of what it had meant to our family. It wasn't just jewelry. It was memory, connection, and a reminder of everything Grandma had lived through. I had promised her, in my own quiet way, that she would have it, but only after she understood what it symbolized. I remembered the first time Grandma had let me peek inside her jewelry box. I was 7, fumbling with the tiny clasps, and she had laughed softly, a sound that could fill a room with warmth. Each piece told a story. The locket from her mother, the earrings from her sister, the simple gold band that had belonged to her father. Grandma had been careful to weave history into ordinary objects, so that every glance at a ring or pendant reminded you of who came before you. I had never forgotten that, and now, decades later, I was feeling the weight of that same responsibility. The envelope sat on the table again, now illuminated by the soft morning light coming through the kitchen window. I had opened it before, many years ago, but only once, when curiosity had gnawed at me. Inside was a folded piece of paper, neatly typed, listing the insurance appraisal of Grandma's most prized possessions. At the time, I didn't understand why she had insisted I never mention the value. It seemed excessive to attach numbers to love, to memory. But now, with Lily waiting, I understood it wasn't about the money at all. It was about teaching respect, patience, and awareness of what inheritance truly meant. I moved the envelope closer and ran my fingers over the fold, feeling the crisp paper beneath my skin. There was a quiet anticipation, a kind of reverent tension that only comes when a moment seems larger than life. I could hear Lily in the next room, humming, completely unaware of the gravity of what she had asked for. It struck me that this was a moment many grandparents never get, the chance to pass on not just objects but understanding. I thought about my own father and how he had handled the small inheritance my siblings and I had received. There had been arguments, quick decisions made without thinking, and a lingering sense that something important had been lost, not in objects but in comprehension. I did not want that for Lily. I wanted her to see that a ring was more than gold, that a family's story was worth more than its market price. The morning stretched on, quiet except for the faint tick of the kitchen clock. I debated whether to call her over, to talk her through it, or to let the moment arrive naturally. There was a lesson in waiting, in letting curiosity meet responsibility. I remembered my own impatience at her age, the small indignities of being told, "Not yet," when all you wanted was immediate gratification. And yet, there was also wisdom in waiting. I had learned it too late sometimes, but perhaps she could learn sooner, without the mistakes that had scarred my own adolescence. I took a sip of lukewarm coffee, the bitterness grounding me. My mind wandered back to Grandma again, to the stories she used to tell about resilience and careful planning. The insurance appraisal wasn't simply a number, it was her method of instilling foresight. She wanted the future holders of her legacy to understand that responsibility came with every gift. And I, her only living daughter, had been entrusted with that duty. The phone rang again, startling me. It was a call from my brother, casual and oblivious to the tension that had taken root in my kitchen. He had always been more practical than I was, the kind to rush through life without pausing to examine the emotional weight of decisions. I listened politely as he talked about mundane matters, but my thoughts were already elsewhere, on Lily, on the ring, and on the envelope. The call ended, leaving me alone with the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the rustle of the morning wind against the windowpane. I decided to write a note to accompany the ring when the time came, something more than a slip of paper, something that conveyed the lesson behind the gold. Words have a way of carrying wisdom if you choose them carefully. Perhaps I would tell her about patience, about respect, and about the invisible strings that tie one generation to the next. Maybe then she would see that the envelope was not about wealth but about insight. The day wore on, and I busied myself with small tasks, folding laundry, sweeping the floor, organizing a drawer. Every movement was slow, deliberate, like I was pacing through the memory of my own life as well as the moment I was creating for Lily. Each action was a quiet rehearsal of the lesson I hoped to pass on, a subtle choreography that carried meaning far beyond the mundane. Finally, as the afternoon sun warmed the room, Lily appeared at the doorway, her curiosity written plainly on her face. I could feel her excitement, her eagerness for the story to be simple, for the ring to be hers. But simplicity would not teach her the truth. I had to choose the right moment, the perfect balance of revelation and guidance. I held the envelope in my hand, feeling the weight of anticipation, and prepared to take the first step into the conversation that would define this small inheritance of wisdom. Lily's small hand hovered at the edge of the table, eyes flicking between the envelope and my face. There was a patience I had never expected from someone her age, and yet it was laced with urgency, that silent insistence that she was ready to claim something she didn't fully understand. I offered a gentle smile, trying to convey that this was a moment she could not rush. She frowned slightly, puzzled by my hesitation, but didn't speak. The air between us was filled with an invisible tension, the kind that grows from unspoken expectation. I took a deep breath, recalling my own impatience when I was Lily's age. I had always wanted the answers immediately, the treasures unwrapped without waiting, the explanations given before I had a chance to think. Grandma had been the one to teach me restraint, though I hadn't appreciated it then. She would have told me that value is more than the surface, that understanding precedes possession. Now, standing in the kitchen with Lily, I could feel that lesson looping back, threading its way through time from her to me. Do you remember when I told you Grandma wanted you to understand her stories first? I asked quietly, almost as if speaking aloud might make the moment disappear. Lily nodded, though her eyes betrayed both curiosity and impatience. She had always been quick to learn, quick to want, and I wondered if she would grasp the weight of what lay folded inside the envelope. I had tried to prepare her in little ways through stories and conversations, but some lessons could not be explained. They had to be experienced. The envelope was heavy in my hand, though it was just paper and ink. I could feel the folds through the thin surface, the slight crinkle where it had been sealed, as though even the texture was whispering caution. I wanted to make her see that what she sought was more than an object, that it carried stories, choices, and responsibilities from generations before her. Grandma had built this teaching into a ritual, and now I was the keeper, the one charged with passing it on carefully. I unfolded the envelope slowly, allowing Lily a tentative glance without revealing everything. Inside were the pages of the insurance appraisal, carefully typed and organized. Numbers, values, dates, and notes filled the paper, but to Lily, they were just words and figures. I watched her face, searching for comprehension, for that flicker of awareness that what she held in her hands was more than material. I wondered if I had waited too long, or perhaps not long enough, for this very moment to resonate. My thoughts drifted briefly to my own family's reactions to inheritance. My siblings had been practical, even careless at times, taking what they could immediately, missing the depth behind objects passed down. I had not wanted Lily to make the same mistake, to see the ring as a possession alone. I wanted her to understand it was a touch point, a memory, a responsibility she would carry. The appraisal was a tool, a reminder that history and care are intertwined, that value extends beyond numbers into legacy. I handed her the first page gently, and she peered at it, squinting slightly at the typed figures. "It's just numbers," she said softly, almost dismissively. I could feel the impatience in her voice, but also the curiosity that was growing, like a flame licking at dry wood. I leaned closer and shared a story, one about how Grandma had acquired the ring, the choices she had made in saving and sacrificing for it. I described the small triumphs, the quiet moments of joy and worry, and the invisible labor behind every decision. Lily listened, and I could see her perspective beginning to shift, the numbers taking on a life that the paper alone could never convey. There was a pause, a quiet moment when only the sound of our breathing filled the space. I could feel the tension stretching thin between us, the unspoken question of when she would truly understand. I remembered my own moments of comprehension, the slow dawning of lessons that had been hidden in everyday experiences. Perhaps Lily's awakening would be just as gradual, each number and date eventually connecting to the stories that gave them meaning. I decided to guide her through the next pages, one section at a time. The appraisal detailed each item's description, value, and history. As I read aloud, I emphasized the stories, the decisions, the human hands behind every notation. Lily leaned in, her initial impatience softening into intrigue. Her eyes tracked the words, her fingers tracing the folds of the paper, as if feeling the texture could help her understand the weight of history it carried. As the afternoon waned, I saw her start to connect dots. The sacrifices Grandma had made, the careful thought in selecting items, and the principle that objects are extensions of memory. She began to ask questions not about the monetary value, but about the choices behind each appraisal. Why did she choose this design? Who wore it first? Did she ever regret giving it away? Each question reflected a growing awareness, a shift from desire to comprehension, from wanting to understanding. I realized then that the envelope was working as intended, not as a measure of wealth, but as a vehicle of insight. Grandma had planned this, even after her death, ensuring that whoever held her possessions would see beyond surface value. Lily was beginning to see that patience and attention were required to fully honor legacy. I felt a quiet satisfaction, tempered with relief, knowing that the lesson was unfolding as it should, that history was connecting to present understanding. By the time evening settled, Lily had the first page memorized, not for the numbers, but for the stories behind them. She had begun to appreciate the subtle intricacies that made each item significant, the human labor, the emotional investment, and the care embedded into every choice. I folded the paper gently and placed it back in the envelope, feeling the quiet triumph of a lesson started, a bridge built between past and present. The next morning, the envelope rested on the table as though it had become a talisman overnight, quietly commanding attention. Lily approached it with a mixture of reverence and curiosity, her fingers hovering just above the paper before she finally dared to touch it. I watched her, thinking about how fragile these moments could be, how easily the lesson of patience might slip away if mishandled. I reminded myself that this was not just about the ring or its value. It was about seeing the care, sacrifice, and thought embedded into every choice Grandma had made. The envelope had become a bridge between her past and the life she was now stepping into, one careful page at a time. Lily picked up the appraisal and studied it again, this time more slowly, letting the words sink in. She asked questions that were sharper, more thoughtful than before, not about price but about purpose and history. Who had owned each item first? Why had Grandma preserved certain things rather than others? I realized that she was beginning to understand that value is rarely immediate. It accrues from patience, understanding, and the reverence one brings to memory. I tried to guide her gently, answering in ways that encouraged reflection rather than providing quick conclusions. As she flipped through the pages, I remembered moments from my own childhood when my grandmother had taught me similar lessons, often in silence. I had not recognized the weight of her words or gestures then, but I remembered the patience, the deliberate care, and the way she made ordinary objects feel like extensions of memory. Watching Lily navigate the appraisal, I felt the same sense of anticipation and quiet pride that had accompanied my own small awakenings. It was as if the cycle was repeating itself, but with a new generation learning to honor legacy in its own way. Lily paused on a description of the ring itself, her brow furrowed. She turned to me and asked if it really mattered how much it was worth. I shook my head slowly, feeling the familiar ache of having been misunderstood at her age. The value isn't in the numbers, Lily. It's in the story, in the care, and in what it represents. That's what Grandma wanted you to see first. She nodded, the beginnings of comprehension flickering across her features. Her impatience seemed to soften, replaced by a quiet focus, a willingness to sit with complexity rather than rush to possession. I told her the story of the day Grandma had purchased the ring, how she had saved for months, making sacrifices I had never fully understood as a child. I described the quiet pride in her voice, the careful calculations, and the small joys she had taken in making the decision. Lily listened intently, occasionally glancing down at the appraisal, her fingers lightly tracing the edges of the paper. I noticed a change in her posture, a subtle shift from casual curiosity to genuine attentiveness. She was starting to grasp that ownership was never merely physical. It carried weight, responsibility, and memory. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, illuminating the folds of the envelope in a soft glow. It was a simple moment, yet charged with significance. I realized that this was more than a lesson about patience or value. It was a passage into understanding how history, choices, and care intertwine. Lily asked about other items in Grandma's collection, and I shared stories behind each one, sometimes pausing to let her reflect before continuing. The process was slow, deliberate, and intimate, a quiet conversation across generations that didn't require grand gestures. I could feel a subtle shift in Lily as she asked about the ring's design, its engravings, and why Grandma had chosen a particular stone. Each question was a step toward empathy, toward seeing beyond surface desire. I answered with care, weaving in anecdotes that revealed character, decision-making, and devotion. Her eyes brightened with understanding, and for the first time, she seemed to realize that what she wanted was connected to what she needed to know. The ring was no longer just an object. It was a story, a choice, and a responsibility she could begin to carry. Later, I found myself reflecting on my own reactions to inheritance and expectation. I remembered arguments among family members over small possessions, moments of greed or misunderstanding, and the regret that followed. I didn't want Lily to inherit that kind of tension. I wanted her to approach these moments with awareness, respect, and a sense of connection to the past. The envelope, with its quiet weight and stories, had become a teaching tool, guiding her in a way that words alone never could. By evening, Lily had begun to take notes in her own way, jotting down observations, questions, and impressions. She wasn't recording numbers. She was capturing stories, intentions, and insights. I felt a sense of relief mixed with pride. This was the beginning of true understanding, a bridge between desire and comprehension that had been built slowly and thoughtfully. It was a reminder that lessons worth learning rarely happen all at once, that patience and attention are as important as knowledge itself. As night fell, Lily carefully refolded the appraisal and placed it back in the envelope. She looked up at me, a quiet smile on her face, and I realized she had grasped the essence of what Grandma had intended. Not the monetary worth, not the material gain, but the significance of care, decision, and memory. In that moment, I felt a subtle shift, a bond strengthened, a lesson begun, and a bridge laid for her to carry forward. Even as Lily began to understand the weight behind the ring, a subtle tension lingered in the room. The envelope lay between us like a quiet judge, its presence reminding me of the unspoken expectations Grandma had left behind. I noticed the way Lily's fingers hesitated when she reached for it, as though she were aware that touching it meant stepping into a story not fully hers yet. I wanted her to appreciate the patience behind the gesture, but there was also an undercurrent of curiosity and desire that I couldn't ignore. That tension was natural. It was part of learning to navigate legacy and responsibility at the same time. I decided to share a deeper story from Grandma's life, one that she had never told me in full. I spoke of a moment when Grandma had faced a choice between selling a cherished heirloom to cover an unexpected expense or finding another way to manage. She had chosen the latter, preserving both the item and its history. I watched Lily's eyes widen as she absorbed the significance. She began to understand that the ring wasn't merely an object of beauty or financial value, but a symbol of endurance, sacrifice, and foresight. The lesson was subtle, but it carried weight that numbers alone could never convey. Lily asked why Grandma hadn't spoken more about the ring while she was alive, and I hesitated before answering. It was true that much of Grandma's life had been private, measured, and deliberate. She had always believed that understanding should come from reflection rather than explanation. I explained this to Lily, highlighting that sometimes the most meaningful gifts are wrapped not in words but in intention. The room was quiet for a moment as she processed what I had said, her gaze drifting toward the envelope once more. The way she looked at it suggested she was beginning to feel the gravity of the responsibility it carried. We spent the next hour examining other items in the appraisal, each with its own story, each with its own subtle lesson. Lily was particularly drawn to a brooch that had belonged to a distant cousin, and she asked how Grandma had decided to keep it. I told her about the sacrifices behind every choice, how preserving one item meant letting go of another. Her questions shifted from simple curiosity to a more contemplative tone, and I could sense the beginnings of an internal dialogue in her mind. She was learning to weigh value in ways that extended beyond surface appearances, starting to understand the balance between desire and respect. At one point, Lily paused and looked directly at me, her expression serious. She asked if it was wrong to feel disappointed that she couldn't have the ring immediately. I nodded gently, acknowledging her feelings without judgment. I explained that disappointment was natural, that longing often accompanies lessons in patience, and that what mattered most was how she responded to that feeling. Her shoulders relaxed slightly, and I could see that she was internalizing the idea that inheritance carried emotional weight as well as tangible benefit. It was a quiet turning point in the afternoon, subtle but profound. Later, as the sun dipped lower in the sky, I shared with Lily my own regrets about misunderstanding Grandma's lessons when I was her age. I recounted a time when I had focused solely on possession, ignoring the care, history, and intention behind the objects in her home. That confession seemed to resonate with Lily, who nodded thoughtfully. She began to verbalize her reflections, realizing that the envelope and its contents were teaching her to approach life with more awareness, consideration, and empathy. For the first time, she seemed to grasp that patience and reflection could transform ordinary moments into profound lessons. A knock at the door interrupted our conversation, and I felt a small ripple of anxiety. It was only a neighbor delivering a package, but the timing made me realize how easily external events could intrude on moments of introspection. Lily glanced at the envelope again, a mixture of curiosity and longing in her eyes. I reminded her gently that the lessons weren't about rushing to possession, but about understanding, empathy, and connection. She seemed to hear me, her hands resting lightly on the envelope as if acknowledging the silent guidance it offered. It was a delicate balance, teaching without forcing, guiding without controlling. We ended the evening with quiet reflection, sitting at the kitchen table and talking about the importance of legacy and choice. Lily asked thoughtful questions about how to honor objects and memories, and I responded with stories from Grandma's life that highlighted intention, sacrifice, and foresight. Each story seemed to strengthen her understanding, revealing the depth behind what might otherwise have seemed like a simple request for a ring. I noticed that she began to approach the envelope with a newfound respect, as though it were not merely paper and appraisal, but a gateway to understanding her grandmother's life and values. Before bed, Lily returned the envelope to its place, tucking it carefully into a drawer with a deliberate gentleness. She lingered for a moment, glancing back at me with an expression I could not fully read. I sensed both satisfaction and lingering curiosity, an awareness that the lessons were only beginning and that her own reflections would continue long after this evening. I felt a mixture of pride and cautious hope, recognizing that patience, reflection, and care were slowly becoming part of her approach to the world, guided by the quiet wisdom of a grandmother who had thought beyond her own lifetime. The next morning, I found Lily sitting at the kitchen table with the envelope open in front of her. She had been turning the appraisal back and forth in her hands, reading and rereading the numbers, her brow furrowed in concentration. I sensed a shift in her energy, a curiosity that had moved beyond respectful reflection into something more assertive, more impatient. I tried to remain calm, reminding myself that part of passing on legacy was letting her explore its weight in her own way, even if it meant testing boundaries. I walked over quietly and asked what had caught her attention, expecting a simple question about the appraisal. Instead, she asked if the ring's value could be increased if it were sold. Her voice carried a hint of excitement and calculation that startled me more than I anticipated. I paused, letting her words sink in. The envelope was no longer a quiet vessel of lessons. It had become a source of tension. I realized that Lily was beginning to measure relationships and objects by their material worth, an instinct that could overshadow the subtle guidance Grandma had hoped to impart. I explained gently that value is not always tied to money, that the ring carried stories, memories, and lessons that could never be measured in dollars. I shared anecdotes about Grandma wearing it through significant moments, teaching patience, endurance, and the importance of understanding the depth behind what we inherit. Lily listened, but I could see her mind balancing numbers against sentiment. As the morning unfolded, a new layer of unease settled between us. Lily began asking about other possessions Grandma had left behind, comparing their appraisals, and speculating aloud about what she could keep, sell, or trade. Her questions were sharp, calculated, and at times frustratingly detached from the emotional significance I was trying to convey. I felt a pang of anxiety that the lessons Grandma had carefully embedded in her legacy might be lost amid the practical assessment of wealth. I decided to pause, suggesting we take a walk outside to clear our minds and reconnect beyond the numbers on the page. Outside, the garden was quiet, the air thick with the scent of late summer flowers. I pointed to the roses Grandma had tended herself, recalling how she had always said that nurturing something living required patience, understanding, and respect. I tried to draw a parallel between the care she put into the garden and the care she expected for her heirlooms. But Lily's eyes wandered, focused instead on the sunlight glinting off the appraisal paper tucked into my bag. I felt the tug of frustration, wondering how to impart the depth of legacy when the allure of tangible value was so strong. I reminded myself to stay patient, to guide without controlling, and to let her confront her own understanding of priorities. Back inside, the tension escalated subtly. Lily began examining each item individually, weighing them, making notes, and occasionally glancing at me as if seeking approval. I felt a quiet unease, realizing that the appraisal, meant to clarify and honor Grandma's intentions, had inadvertently introduced a competitive, transactional mindset. I took a deep breath, reminding myself that her curiosity and drive were not inherently wrong. They simply required direction and reflection. I started asking her questions, prompting her to think beyond monetary worth, to consider emotional resonance, family stories, and the responsibility of stewardship. The dialogue was tentative but necessary. Later that afternoon, a sudden distraction arrived. My son called unexpectedly, asking about the envelope and the appraisal. His tone was casual, but I detected an underlying interest that made me wary. I listened carefully, recognizing the subtle shift in dynamics that can occur when others become involved in matters of inheritance. I explained lightly that we were simply reflecting on Grandma's life and the meaning behind her possessions, trying not to spark conflict. I sensed Lily watching me closely, absorbing not just the information but the manner in which I handled the conversation. It was a lesson in diplomacy and restraint, one that could not be taught by numbers or objects alone. The day grew long, and with each passing hour, Lily's engagement with the envelope seemed to change. She moved from curiosity to a quiet contemplation, occasionally glancing at me with thoughtful expressions that suggested internal struggle. I encouraged her to speak about her thoughts, prompting reflections on what Grandma might have wanted her to understand. Slowly, She began to grasp that the ring and other items were more than possessions. They were vessels of memory, intention, and ethical consideration. There were still tensions and unanswered questions, but the early signs of reflection gave me hope that her understanding was evolving in a meaningful direction. By evening, I could see the balance shifting. Lily approached the envelope not as a tool for gain, but as a prompt for thought, testing her understanding of Grandma's lessons while navigating her own desires. The process was messy, tentative, and at times frustrating, but it carried the promise of insight, maturity, and respect. I felt a quiet sense of relief, recognizing that the conflict introduced by the appraisal had not destroyed the opportunity for teaching, it had created it. Legacy, I realized, was never about control, but about guidance, patience, and the willingness to allow lessons to unfold in their own time. The next morning, I noticed a shift in Lily that I hadn't expected. She was quieter, more introspective, sitting at the dining table with the envelope and appraisal spread before her. Something about the way she traced the ring's details with her finger suggested a growing awareness of the weight it carried, beyond its monetary value. I joined her cautiously, unsure whether to speak first or allow her the space to process. I decided to begin softly, sharing a story about the time Grandma had worn the ring during a particularly difficult moment in her life. I hoped that by illustrating the emotional history behind it, I could guide Lily toward understanding the depth of legacy rather than the surface value. As I recounted the story, I noticed a flicker of emotion in Lily's eyes, a mix of surprise and quiet reverence. The ring had always been a symbol in our family, but perhaps she had never realized the gravity of the choices it represented. I could feel the tension lingering between curiosity and understanding, a line we were both learning to navigate. Lily listened intently, nodding occasionally, her hands clasped together as if holding back questions. I sensed an internal debate, her mind trying to reconcile the sentimental weight with the practicality she had shown the day before. It was a delicate balance, and I tried to offer guidance without imposing. Then, unexpectedly, she asked a question that made my heart tighten. Could the ring be replaced if it were lost? She didn't speak of theft or negligence. Rather, it was curiosity about how fragile memories can be converted into objects. I paused, realizing that this line of inquiry was deeper than mere materialism. She was asking about permanence, the endurance of family history, and the ways in which legacy survives beyond the tangible. I responded with a story about Grandma losing a precious heirloom long ago and the lessons she had drawn from that experience. Lessons about patience, humility, and the true measure of value. The afternoon stretched into a quiet discussion of what it meant to inherit responsibility. Lily began reflecting aloud, sometimes with hesitation, sometimes with insight, about how an object could carry the weight of a family's choices and memories. I encouraged her to consider what Grandma might have hoped for her, not in terms of profit, but in terms of respect and care for the stories embedded in each possession. Her questions became less transactional and more philosophical, probing the emotional resonance rather than the financial appraisal. It was as if the envelope, once a source of tension, had become a catalyst for understanding. Late in the day, a phone call disrupted the rhythm we had established. My son asked casually about the appraisal, inquiring whether the envelope contained anything important. His tone suggested that he had been thinking about inheritance in a practical way, possibly at odds with the reflective lessons I was trying to instill. I kept my voice calm, emphasizing the sentimental and ethical value rather than the numbers. I could see Lily glancing at me, absorbing not only my words but the subtle discipline of responding with care and tact. In that moment, she was learning more than I could have taught in hours of conversation alone. After the call, we retreated to the living room. I suggested we sit together and look through some old photographs Grandma had kept. Each image told a story, often linked to moments where she had faced difficult decisions with grace and patience. Lily's demeanor shifted again, becoming quieter, more thoughtful. She was beginning to grasp that inheritance was more than objects. It was a series of choices, memories, and responsibilities passed down through generations. The ring was a symbol, yes, but its significance lay in the narrative it represented. As evening approached, Lily finally spoke with a measure of clarity I hadn't seen before. She asked me how I had decided what to do with Grandma's possessions, how I had weighed sentiment against practicality. The question caught me off guard, but I answered honestly, recounting the moments of doubt, reflection, and the occasional quiet heartache. I shared that every decision had been guided not by value alone, but by a desire to honor Grandma's intent and the lessons she had silently passed to us. Lily listened, nodding slowly, the tension in her posture easing slightly as comprehension settled in. By the time night fell, a quiet understanding had formed between us. The envelope and appraisal, once a source of friction and tension, had become tools of reflection. Lily was learning that legacy was not merely about possession or profit. It was about carrying forward wisdom, respect, and careful consideration. I could feel a subtle pride in the way she had navigated the questions, the curiosity, and the initial impatience. Though there was still work to be done, the early signs of insight suggested that the journey she was undertaking was more meaningful than either of us had anticipated. The next morning, a tension I hadn't anticipated hung in the air as soon as my son arrived. He had come by under the pretense of helping organize some of Grandma's belongings, but I could sense an undercurrent in his voice, a subtle insistence on speed and practicality rather than reflection or care. Lily sat nearby, silently observing the exchange, and I wondered if she could feel the difference between curiosity guided by thought and curiosity guided by ambition. The room, usually filled with quiet warmth in the mornings, now carried a fragile edge, and I could sense that the story of the ring was about to take a more complicated turn. My son began asking about the appraisal, casually at first, but with an insistence that suggested preoccupation with potential gain. I tried to remain composed, keeping my voice steady, as I reminded him of the ring's sentimental value, the stories behind it, and the lessons Grandma had passed down. His response was measured, polite, yet carried a faint pressure, a subtle tension that made my chest tighten. I realized then that this was more than a discussion about an object. It was a test of values, a confrontation between pragmatism and emotional legacy. Lily watched closely, her eyes alternating between us, absorbing the nuances of the exchange as though learning an unspoken code about family and respect. The conversation shifted when my son suggested that perhaps the appraisal should be filed somewhere visible, maybe even scanned for reference. I nodded, acknowledging the practical aspect, but also reminded him that the envelope's true importance was not numbers but history. I sensed that Lily was processing more than the conversation itself. She was observing how adults negotiate between duty, greed, and morality. Her hands fiddled with a corner of the envelope, nervous energy radiating from her in quiet, contained movements. I could feel a lesson forming in her mind, one that could not be articulated but could be deeply understood. Then, unexpectedly, my son's tone sharpened slightly. He asked pointedly if there were other valuables Grandma had left behind, as if trying to gauge the extent of inheritance in ways that bypassed sentiment. The shift in his demeanor was subtle but unmistakable, and I felt a twinge of defensiveness rise in me. I maintained my calm, responding with facts and history, but I also allowed myself a quiet, internal acknowledgement of hurt. There was a moment, a pause, where I felt the gravity of family dynamics pressing in, a tension that was both personal and deeply relational. Lily seemed to sense the weight, her posture stiffening slightly, and I realized that she was learning more than just the story of a ring. She was witnessing the complexities of loyalty, ethics, and trust. The hours passed with a strange mixture of normalcy and underlying strain. We sorted through boxes of photographs, letters, and keepsakes, each item sparking conversation about choices made, consequences faced, and the values Grandma had upheld. My son contributed minimally, occasionally making pragmatic suggestions, while Lily began to speak more freely, posing questions about Grandma's intentions, her decisions, and the significance of each object. I encouraged her, mindful of guiding rather than dictating, allowing her to form her own interpretations. It was clear that she was beginning to understand the delicate balance between appreciating heritage and asserting curiosity. By mid-afternoon, A quiet confrontation emerged without words. Lily hesitated near the envelope again, glancing at me, and then at her father. She asked if it would ever be hers to handle completely, her voice gentle but inquisitive. My son interjected, suggesting that some responsibilities were best left to those with experience and maturity. I felt a surge of protectiveness, not over objects, but over the lessons embedded in them. I reminded them both that inheritance was as much about responsibility as it was about ownership. There was a subtle lesson here, one that couldn't be forced but had to be absorbed, lived, and reflected upon. The ring and the appraisal had become symbols not merely of wealth, but of integrity, patience, and moral discernment. As the day drew to a close, I noticed the quiet changes in Lily. Her initial curiosity, tinged with eagerness, had evolved into thoughtfulness and reflection. She had witnessed the tension between her father and me, seen the delicate negotiations of principle, and felt the weight of legacy in a way that was deeply personal. The envelope, once a source of potential conflict, had transformed into a mirror of ethical challenges, family dynamics, and the invisible lessons that inheritance carries. I felt a quiet pride, tempered by the recognition that the journey was only beginning, and that the ring's significance would unfold slowly as choices and understanding continued to emerge. That evening, after my son had left, Lily lingered in the room, staring at the envelope. She turned to me and whispered a simple question about what Grandma might have thought seeing her hold the ring now. I realized that she was internalizing not only the history but the responsibility, the care, and the thoughtfulness required to handle what was entrusted to her. It was a subtle victory, one that did not announce itself with drama, but with a quiet understanding of the deeper currents of respect, patience, and moral inheritance. The first true lesson of the ring had been absorbed, and I could sense the path ahead, complex, challenging, but filled with potential for growth and understanding. The morning sun filtered through the curtains, painting soft streaks across the living room where the envelope still rested on the table. I watched Lily approach it cautiously, her small hands hovering above the paper as though it were a delicate creature that might vanish if touched too soon. There was a weight in the air, a quiet tension that neither her father nor I needed to speak of. The events of yesterday had left a subtle mark on her, a mix of curiosity and caution, and I realized this moment could define the way she understood family, trust, and the value of patience. I cleared my throat softly, trying not to interrupt, and asked her gently what she felt as she looked at it. Her gaze lingered, thoughtful and serious, and I could see the wheels turning behind her eyes. She whispered, almost to herself, a question about whether Grandma had imagined someone like her would ever hold this responsibility. The honesty in her voice struck me, because it was not about ownership or wealth. It was about meaning, about living up to an invisible promise embedded in a family legacy. I nodded slowly, telling her that Grandma had always hoped her stories and her objects would teach lessons that numbers alone could never convey. Lily's hands finally settled on the envelope, her fingers brushing its surface lightly. There was a pause, a moment where silence felt heavier than words, and I realized she was testing herself, weighing the impulse to peek against the wisdom of waiting. The phone rang abruptly, breaking the quiet spell, and my son's voice came through the line, cheerful yet carrying a faint impatience. He asked if I had looked at the appraisal yet, and I replied carefully, emphasizing that the timing was not about rushing but about respect for the intention behind it. Lily glanced at me, a flicker of frustration crossing her features, and I took the opportunity to remind her that understanding comes slowly, not hurried by external pressure. I could see the lesson taking root subtly, forming a careful understanding of discernment and moral patience. Each glance, each hesitation, was a step along a path that would eventually become her own. As the day progressed, the temptation of the envelope seemed to grow. Lily tried to focus on drawing at the table nearby, but her eyes kept flicking toward it. I noticed the conflict in her, the tug-of-war between immediate curiosity and deliberate restraint, and I felt a mixture of pride and concern. It was a delicate moment to guide without imposing, and I found myself narrating stories from Grandma's youth, subtly weaving in examples of patience, responsibility, and trustworthiness. These anecdotes were not lessons in lecture form. They were glimpses of lived experience, vivid enough to linger in Lily's mind and shape her understanding organically. At one point, she asked about the jewelry itself, questioning whether the appraisal reflected its sentimental value or merely its monetary worth. I explained that the numbers were secondary, that the true value lay in stories, memories, and lessons passed down through generations. She absorbed this quietly, then asked a question that made my chest tighten slightly: whether someone could ever misuse the envelope if they wanted to. I paused, measuring my words carefully, and reminded her gently that ethics and character were more powerful than any piece of paper, and that she had the chance to embody those principles herself. Her eyes widened in comprehension, and I sensed a subtle shift in her demeanor, a move toward understanding responsibility as a living practice, not just an abstract idea. Later, my son arrived unannounced, carrying a stack of old photographs and letters. He began to sort them out, scanning the documents, making notes, and asking occasional questions, but he did not approach the envelope. I watched the interplay between them carefully. Lily's resolve seemed to strengthen in his presence. The earlier hesitation now transformed into quiet confidence. I could see her understanding of boundaries deepening, the invisible distinction between curiosity and entitlement becoming tangible in her posture, her glances, and the deliberate care with which she handled objects. The lessons Grandma had embedded were unfolding naturally, quietly, without confrontation or overt instruction. By evening, I sensed a culmination approaching. Lily took the envelope in her hands deliberately, turned it over, and then carefully slid it back into its place on the table without opening it. I held my breath, knowing that this single act carried more weight than words could convey. It was a silent acknowledgement of principle, of trust, and of moral growth. My son looked on, slightly puzzled, but I did not feel the need to explain. The lesson was internalized, the weight of legacy honored, and a bridge had been formed between curiosity and ethical restraint. Lily had learned, in her own measured way, the significance of patience, respect, and understanding the deeper meaning of inheritance beyond material gain. That night, after Lily had gone to bed, I sat alone with the envelope for a few moments, reflecting on the day. The ring and its appraisal had become more than objects. They were markers of growth, tests of character, and a reminder of the responsibilities we inherit alongside material possessions. I realized that the true inheritance is not in wealth, but in the careful cultivation of values, judgment, and integrity. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, perhaps renewed pressure, but for tonight, there was quiet satisfaction in knowing that Lily had taken the first step toward embodying the principles Grandma had cherished all her life. The next morning arrived with an unusual tension in the air. I could feel it the moment I stepped into the kitchen. The subtle way my son's footsteps echoed on the floor, the hurried movement of Lily preparing her breakfast with a seriousness beyond her years. The envelope was still on the table, untouched, but the knowledge of it hovered like a silent witness. I had hoped that yesterday's quiet lesson had settled something in her, but now I sensed a different kind of pressure building, one that came from outside rather than within. My son, perhaps unconsciously, was testing the boundaries he thought he understood. I wondered how much of this lesson in patience could survive the intrusion of adult impatience and family expectation. He leaned against the counter, casually mentioning the upcoming family gathering. His tone was light, almost teasing, but the words carried an undercurrent of expectation. The appraisal, he implied, was meant for review, for discussion, perhaps even for redistribution according to what he thought was fair. I kept my expression neutral, answering with gentle reminders that some things were meant to be absorbed first, felt and understood, not acted on immediately. Lily's eyes met mine across the table, a quiet reflection of the tension that had taken root. She seemed to understand the stakes without needing me to articulate them, but I could see the curiosity and concern battling within her. During breakfast, my son brought up old family grievances casually, as if the envelope was not just about a piece of jewelry, but a lens through which past slights and resentments could be examined. I noticed Lily's small hands tightening around her fork, a subtle but telling sign of unease. I could see the struggle in her young mind, balancing love for her father with the recognition that not all things measured by money reflected justice or intention. I interjected with soft anecdotes of Grandma's generosity, her attention to moral legacy, and the way she had woven values into her belongings, hoping that Lily would absorb the lessons as much as the story. The attempt to redirect the conversation toward meaning rather than contention seemed to have a temporary effect, but I could sense the tension lingering like an invisible thread, pulling at the edges of the morning. Later, as the day unfolded, my son suggested they all examine the envelope together. I hesitated, careful not to show irritation, and reminded him that timing and consent were integral to trust. He brushed off my caution, citing practicality and curiosity. In response, I found myself recounting moments from my own youth, when impatience had led to mistakes, misunderstandings, and even regret. Lily listened intently, absorbing not just the words but the cadence, the pauses, the emotion behind them. I realized that this was becoming more than a lesson about inheritance. It was evolving into an ethical battlefield where respect, patience, and character would either survive or falter under pressure. By afternoon, the strain was tangible. Lily suggested they play outside, needing space to process without adult scrutiny. As she ran across the yard, I noticed her glances back at the house, a silent tether linking her to the envelope. I followed her in spirit, narrating internally the inner lessons she was negotiating silently. It occurred to me that the temptation of external pressure, family expectation, and inherited responsibility could shape a person's moral compass in ways as profound as any formal instruction. Observing her, I realized that character and integrity were tested not in isolation but under the quiet weight of expectation and curiosity from others. In the evening, my son returned to the subject, pressing the appraisal's significance as if ignoring it might be careless or ungrateful. I felt the tension rise and reminded both of us that ownership carried responsibility beyond material value, that Grandma had intended for these moments to cultivate judgment, discernment, and emotional maturity. Lily's posture shifted slightly. Her awareness of the unfolding dynamic was growing. She was beginning to sense not only the weight of the inheritance but also the ethical tension of negotiation, fairness, and patience. I could see the first hints of autonomy forming in her actions, her decisions guided by thoughtfulness rather than impulse. Dinner passed in a quieter than usual tone. The envelope remained on the table, a passive presence but charged with potential disruption. I reflected inwardly on how family expectations, even subtle ones, could shape behavior and choices profoundly. Lily's restraint in the face of her father's subtle pressure made me proud, yet I also felt the sting of worry. Would the lessons of yesterday be sufficient to withstand the repeated tests of curiosity, expectation, and subtle manipulation? The envelope was no longer just a piece of paper. It was a mirror, reflecting our characters back at us with unflinching clarity. As night approached, I guided Lily to write in her journal, a personal reflection on the day's lessons. She hesitated at first, then began with careful sentences that revealed her inner deliberation, her comprehension of value beyond money, and her quiet defiance of pressure. I read over her shoulder only once, enough to see that she had grasped the essence of Grandma's wisdom. That moment felt like a small victory in a larger, ongoing journey. My son, upstairs in his room, remained unaware of this quiet triumph, and I realized the lesson had transcended the need for confrontation. Lily's understanding of respect, timing, and ethical responsibility had deepened under the subtle but persistent weight of family expectation. I ended the night reflecting on the delicate balance between teaching and enforcing. The envelope, still untouched, represented more than jewelry. It represented the collision of curiosity, moral responsibility, and familial influence. I knew that tomorrow would bring new pressures, perhaps renewed attempts to assert authority or impatience, but I felt a quiet certainty that Lily had taken critical steps toward understanding the deeper significance of inheritance. The true test was not in the material object itself, but in the resilience of character, the careful negotiation of ethical tension, and the quiet assertion of values that were invisible but foundational. The morning sunlight streamed softly through the living room windows, casting long, slanted shadows across the floor, shadows that seemed to mimic the tension I felt inside. I watched Lily sitting cross-legged on the rug, the envelope clutched carefully in her small hands. The weight of it, though physical, carried something heavier, an almost invisible gravity of expectation, judgment, and legacy. Her gaze flicked toward the kitchen where my son busied himself with his coffee, unaware, or perhaps only partially aware, of the internal struggle unfolding before him. The air was thick, quiet but anticipatory, as if the house itself held its breath, waiting for the next move. I approached slowly, sitting beside her without speaking, letting silence do what words could not. Lily turned the envelope over in her hands, studying it like it contained secrets older than either of us. I remembered my own childhood and the first times I had been asked to make decisions that felt bigger than me, decisions weighted with moral consequence. There was always a moment of hesitation, that brief pause where understanding wrestled with impulse, and I could see that same hesitation mirrored in her expression. I gently asked her how she felt, keeping my voice calm, low, and encouraging. Her response was thoughtful, tinged with the quiet wisdom that children sometimes acquire too quickly when faced with grown-up dilemmas. She began to speak slowly, choosing her words with care, about what the envelope represented beyond the tangible item inside. She mentioned Grandma, her stories, and the lessons she had tried to teach without ever needing to say them outright. She reflected on patience, fairness, and how some things in life demanded more than immediate desire. They required contemplation, understanding, and the courage to act correctly even when it was difficult. I listened, letting each sentence sink, realizing that Lily was navigating not just the envelope, but the unspoken expectations placed upon her by family and legacy alike. The quiet contemplation was broken when my son entered the room, his tone casual but probing. He asked questions, trying to gauge whether Lily had opened it, whether she understood its value, whether she could make sense of it all. I felt the familiar rise of tension, the same tension that had been threading through the house since yesterday. Lily's response was measured. She explained that she wanted to fully understand first, that she didn't want to rush or risk missing something important. I noticed the subtle shift in my son's posture, a flicker of impatience met with growing respect, or at least curiosity, for the way Lily was asserting herself without confrontation. As the day progressed, the envelope became the quiet center of a moral experiment. I observed how Lily interacted with both her father and me, noticing how her reasoning, choices, and even small gestures reflected a growing confidence rooted in ethical thought rather than impulsive desire. She asked questions about responsibility, fairness, and the consequences of choices, demonstrating a remarkable awareness for someone her age. My son, initially dismissive, began to engage with her in a more thoughtful way, responding with explanations and sometimes concessions, though still guided by his own perspective on value and propriety. It became evident that the envelope was catalyzing growth on multiple fronts, subtly reshaping the dynamics between parent and child. I took the opportunity to recount more stories of Grandma, stories that highlighted moments when she had faced challenges and made decisions guided by moral clarity rather than convenience or gain. Lily absorbed these lessons, occasionally interjecting her own observations or questions, which led to dialogue that was as revealing for me as it was instructive for her. It was a delicate dance, a negotiation of learning, patience, and trust. I could see her forming the beginnings of an internal compass, one that would guide her in future situations where the right choice might not be the easiest or most obvious. Late afternoon brought an unexpected turn. A minor argument erupted over a trivial household matter, and in the midst of it, the envelope nearly became a pawn in a power struggle. I felt my stomach tighten as the potential for disruption loomed, but Lily remained calm, her fingers tightening around the envelope without a hint of panic. She stood her ground, stating clearly that the envelope was not a tool for argument or leverage. Her quiet firmness surprised even me. I realized then that she had internalized not only the lessons of patience but also the moral framework Grandma had always exemplified. The moment, though small, felt monumental, a tangible sign of growth, integrity, and quiet resilience. By evening, as the house settled into its usual rhythm, Lily brought the envelope to me voluntarily. She had decided, on her own, to seek guidance rather than immediate action. She wanted to understand the value and history of its contents, to learn before deciding how to proceed. I felt a swell of pride, tempered by relief, as I nodded and guided her through the process of examining the appraisal carefully, explaining the context, the importance of responsible decisions, and the nuances of inheritance beyond material wealth. It was a slow, deliberate process, one that mirrored the life lessons she was learning by living them in miniature through the envelope. Night fell, bringing with it a sense of calm reflection. I watched Lily carefully place the envelope back in a safe spot, her actions deliberate and respectful, and felt the quiet triumph of a lesson truly learned. My son, observing from a distance, seemed to recognize the significance too. His demeanor softened by the evident maturity in his daughter's approach. I reflected on how moments like these, though small in scale, carried the weight of generations, shaping character, decision-making, and family relationships in subtle but lasting ways. The envelope, once a source of potential conflict, had become a tool for growth, understanding, and quiet reconciliation. As I prepared for bed, I thought about the challenges that still lay ahead. Tomorrow would undoubtedly present new pressures, perhaps fresh tests of patience and moral clarity. But tonight, there was a quiet satisfaction in knowing that Lily had taken meaningful steps toward understanding the deeper lessons embedded in the inheritance, learning not just about material value but about responsibility, judgment, and integrity. The envelope remained, a silent witness. Its weight felt not in pounds but in wisdom, ethics, and the slow, deliberate shaping of character. Morning arrived with a crisp clarity, and I could feel a subtle tension simmering beneath the calm exterior of the household. Lily had been unusually quiet at breakfast, her small hands fiddling with the edge of her napkin as she chewed thoughtfully. I noticed the subtle furrow in her brow and knew her mind was elsewhere, likely replaying the discussions we had yesterday about responsibility and judgment. The envelope still rested in its secure spot on the side table, untouched for the morning, yet its presence hovered like an unspoken challenge, a silent reminder of the moral weight it carried. The quiet was broken by the unexpected ring of the phone. My son answered quickly, his tone polite but slightly defensive, and I could hear the faint voices of relatives over the line, distant yet insistent. Their questions were probing, practical at first, asking about the appraisal, the value, and what Lily intended to do, but soon took on a sharper edge. They suggested, with thinly veiled impatience, that perhaps she was being too cautious, that a child need not linger so long over decisions meant for adults. I felt the familiar tightening of my chest, a mixture of frustration and protectiveness, as I watched Lily stiffen slightly, her small frame bracing for the onslaught of judgment. I placed a hand gently on her shoulder, whispering encouragement, reminding her that taking her time was her right, and that true understanding often required patience. She nodded subtly, her eyes fixed on the envelope, as though drawing strength from the symbolic weight it held. The conversation over the phone continued, voices overlapping, a mixture of insistence and curiosity. My son tried to mediate, but the tone remained pointed, the undertone unmistakable, impatience disguised as guidance. Lily remained calm, listening carefully, her responses measured, asserting quietly that she wanted to learn before making any decisions. After the call ended, she sat back, exhaling slowly, and asked me a question that had clearly been forming in her mind. How did Grandma handle situations when people pressured her to act before she was ready? I told her stories of the quiet strength Grandma displayed, how she weighed consequences, how she sometimes resisted even well-meaning urgings from others, and how those decisions shaped the respect and trust people eventually offered her. Lily absorbed these stories with remarkable focus, occasionally interjecting with her own reflections, demonstrating the same emerging wisdom we had witnessed earlier in the envelope discussions. The day moved forward slowly. Family friends arrived, ostensibly to offer help or advice, Yet the underlying intent felt more like observation, as if they were waiting for missteps to pass judgment on. Lily greeted them politely, her behavior calm but deliberate, clearly practicing the boundaries we had discussed. Conversations flowed around her, yet she remained centered, often redirecting questions to the lessons she was trying to understand, rather than yielding to external pressure. I watched her, part awe and part relief, as she maintained a quiet command over her own process, the envelope remaining a grounding symbol of her autonomy. By mid-afternoon, the tension shifted again. A cousin, known for his blunt commentary, made a remark about the pointlessness of delaying decisions over something as small as a ring. The comment, intended to provoke, caused a ripple of unease among the adults. I noticed Lily's hands tighten slightly, the familiar sign that she was preparing to respond thoughtfully rather than react impulsively. She looked directly at him and spoke slowly, emphasizing the value of understanding before action, and why patience was not indecision but insight. Her composure in the face of subtle antagonism impressed me, though I could sense the simmering frustration it created in others who had expected compliance or speed. Later, when the guests left, I and Lily had a quiet conversation in the kitchen, away from the watchful eyes of the extended family. She asked if it was wrong to assert herself when others disagreed. I reminded her that respect often began with self-respect, that understanding and integrity were worth more than immediate approval, and that Grandma had always acted on principle rather than expedience. Lily seemed to process this deeply, nodding slowly, as though internalizing a lesson that would guide her far beyond the envelope and the day's events. The evening brought reflection. Sitting by the window, I watched Lily sketch quietly in her notebook, occasionally glancing at the envelope. She asked questions about how adults navigated disagreement and negotiation, and I shared experiences from my own life. Mistakes, lessons, and moments when patience had ultimately carried the day. She listened intently, clearly comparing my stories with her own developing understanding. The room felt quiet, intimate, a contrast to the earlier chaos, and I recognized the importance of these small, reflective moments in shaping her perspective and strengthening her sense of moral clarity. As night fell, I thought about the external pressures that had tried to sway her decisions, and the strength she had shown in resisting them. The envelope remained safely in its place, a symbol not only of material inheritance but of the moral and ethical inheritance she was cultivating for herself. I felt a mixture of pride and cautious hope, realizing that these lessons were building resilience and discernment that could withstand the next challenges. Tomorrow would likely bring more opinions, perhaps even more subtle tests of patience and judgment. But tonight, there was evidence that Lily was navigating them with wisdom, courage, and quiet integrity. The day ended with a sense of cautious optimism. The envelope, though physically unchanged, had already transformed the household dynamics. Lily's approach, calm yet assertive, had subtly shifted how everyone interacted with her, creating a tentative recognition of her autonomy and insight. I felt the lingering weight of responsibility as I prepared for sleep, thinking about the path ahead. The challenges would continue, but Lily's growing moral compass, reinforced by careful observation, reflection, and guided storytelling, promised that she would face them with the quiet strength and thoughtful judgment that Grandma had always embodied. The morning light fell unevenly across the living room, catching on the edge of the envelope as if it were deliberately signaling the tension it carried. I found Lily seated at the table, her hands folded over the top, her gaze steady yet cautious. The day had arrived when choices and opinions would collide, and I felt the quiet hum of anticipation settle over the house. My son paced near the window, phone in hand, the faint crease between his brows revealing the strain he felt trying to balance authority with patience. Something had shifted in the air, a subtle signal that the envelope had begun to stir emotions that even I hadn't fully anticipated. Lily broke the silence, asking if it was truly necessary to reveal the appraisal now or if it could wait until she felt certain. Her voice carried a weight beyond her years, calm but firm, and I saw my son falter slightly, caught between his instincts as a parent and the persistent insistence of relatives who were already whispering from the background. They had expected a swift answer, a moment of compliance, Yet Lily's resolve quietly challenged the entire dynamic. I felt a surge of pride but tempered it with caution, knowing that family dynamics could shift in unpredictable ways when pride and principle clashed. The conversation grew more intense as my son finally spoke, trying to reason with her, explaining the practicalities of disclosing the envelope's contents. He reminded her that transparency was expected, that hiding information, even with good intentions, could create suspicion. Lily listened intently, nodding but interjecting with her own perspective, explaining that understanding the full value and implications mattered more than meeting someone else's timeline. Her words, measured yet insistent, seemed to push the adults into a temporary silence, forcing them to confront the reality that this was her decision to make. I could sense the tension rising as other relatives joined the discussion, each offering advice layered with judgment. Some were subtle, others more overt, questioning her patience and hinting that waiting too long might be irresponsible. I noticed Lily's eyes flicker toward me for reassurance, and I gave her a small, firm nod. This silent exchange reaffirmed that she wasn't alone, that the legacy of wisdom and careful consideration passed down through generations remained present to guide her. She drew a deep breath, then spoke again, calmly articulating why she needed clarity before acting. The argument slowly morphed into a test of wills. My son's voice rose slightly, not in anger but in exasperation, emphasizing that family expectations sometimes required compromise. I could see the conflict etching itself into his expression, the delicate line between wanting to honor his daughter's autonomy and feeling pressured by his own parents and siblings. Lily, unshaken, explained that her understanding of responsibility included recognizing the pressures but not yielding to them blindly. There was a subtle poetry in her words, an echo of Grandma's careful, principled approach that had often quietly guided our family through far more complex dilemmas. By afternoon, the discussion had expanded into the dining room, where additional relatives gathered, some curious, others quietly impatient. Conversations overlapped, the atmosphere thick with unspoken tension. Lily remained the calm center, responding with intelligence and grace, while I observed the subtle shifts in perception from those around her. The envelope, once merely a container of paper and appraisal, had become a symbol of integrity, patience, and discernment. Its presence demanded that all who watched acknowledge not just its material value, but the moral maturity required to wield it responsibly. Unexpectedly, one cousin, usually quiet, leaned in and spoke of how sometimes young people might act impulsively, citing examples from other families where haste led to regret. Lily responded thoughtfully, pointing out that measured reflection was not hesitation but preparation for sound choices. The conversation continued, a series of probing questions and careful replies, as if the entire family were collectively navigating a delicate dance of understanding, trust, and authority. I noted how the adults' perspectives slowly shifted, the impatience melting into a grudging respect for her steady reasoning. As evening approached, my son suggested a compromise, an idea to reveal part of the appraisal while keeping the details of the larger inheritance private. Lily paused, considering, then explained why partial disclosure could create confusion or false expectations. She wanted honesty and comprehension to be complete, not fragmented. The room grew quiet again, the significance of her stance settling over everyone like a weight. For the first time, I saw nods of acknowledgement from a few of the more skeptical relatives, a silent admission that her reasoning had merit and deserved respect. Later, when the visitors had finally left, Lily and I sat together in the dimming light, reflecting on the day's subtle victories. She asked me if asserting herself had been too much, if she had risked alienating the family. I told her that integrity often invites scrutiny, but the courage to maintain one's convictions is what shapes character. The envelope remained on the table, an unassuming artifact, yet it had already changed the conversation, setting a tone of patience, reflection, and careful judgment. I felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that these lessons, hard-earned and often subtle, were embedding themselves deeply within her understanding. By bedtime, the house had settled, yet the echo of the day lingered. I thought about the ways family can exert pressure, intentionally or not, and how standing firm with wisdom and patience can redirect not only outcomes but perceptions. Lily had learned that day that inheritance wasn't just about material wealth, but about moral clarity, courage, and the quiet power of deliberate choices. As I tucked her in, I realized that the envelope, though still sealed, had already fulfilled part of its purpose. It had become a catalyst for growth, conversation, and the subtle reshaping of family dynamics. The next morning, sunlight spilled unevenly through the lace curtains, illuminating the envelope sitting quietly on the dining table. It had been untouched since the day of our family discussion, yet its presence seemed heavier now, as if it carried the weight of every whispered opinion, every subtle judgment, and every expectation of the people around us. I watched Lily approach it, her movements deliberate, and for a moment, I could see the mix of anticipation and apprehension flicker across her face. This was the moment she had been quietly preparing for, the first step in transforming uncertainty into clarity. She opened the envelope with care, letting the paper unfold slowly. The appraisal was laid bare, each line item revealing more than just monetary value. There was a history woven into the descriptions, subtle notes about craftsmanship, age, and provenance that hinted at the story behind the ring itself. Lily read it carefully, occasionally pausing to absorb the implications, tracing her fingers along the words as though trying to feel the weight of the generations that had preceded her. I realized then that this moment was about more than just an object. It was about understanding the decisions that had led to its survival and the responsibility of stewardship she now held. I noticed the way my son lingered nearby, leaning slightly against the doorway. He had insisted on seeing the appraisal too, though his earlier insistence that it be revealed immediately had softened into something more cautious, more attentive. He recognized that the envelope was no longer a simple matter of inheritance or possession. It had become a test of maturity, insight, and ethical judgment. Lily sensed this, and when she spoke, her voice was steady but firm, articulating exactly what she understood the appraisal to mean, and how she envisioned using this knowledge to honor the legacy rather than simply claim ownership. As she spoke, the room seemed to shift subtly. Relatives who had earlier been impatient now paused, listening. Some exchanged quiet glances, their expressions revealing a reluctant acknowledgement that her patience had given her the clarity that had eluded them. The appraisal was no longer just a document. It was a bridge between generations, connecting past decisions to present responsibility. It became clear that the ring represented not only material wealth but also a lineage of thoughtfulness, sacrifice, and deliberate choice. Lily carefully placed the paper down and turned to me. She asked questions about the notations in the appraisal, wondering how earlier owners had made decisions and what mistakes or insights they had encountered. I answered as best I could, offering context drawn from years of stories, memories, and quiet observations that had never seemed urgent until now. She listened, absorbing each nuance, and I felt a swell of pride. In that moment, I realized the envelope had already served its purpose. It had initiated a dialogue that transcended simple curiosity or greed, encouraging reflection, understanding, and careful discernment. Later, my son joined the conversation more fully, contributing thoughts on how the appraisal might affect future plans or decisions regarding the ring. His tone was measured, respectful, a stark contrast to the urgency he had displayed the day before. He began to appreciate that this was about education, mentorship, and the slow cultivation of wisdom. The younger generation, represented by Lily, was not just inheriting an object. They were inheriting a responsibility that demanded insight, patience, and moral clarity. The discussion grew into a shared reflection, a collective contemplation of how possessions could carry meaning far beyond their surface value. Relatives who had been initially critical now contributed their own memories of the ring, its journey through years of family milestones, and the unspoken lessons it symbolized. Lily asked thoughtful questions, prompting stories and recollections that might otherwise have gone untold. I felt a quiet satisfaction watching her engage with history in such a thoughtful way, bridging the gap between the past and the present. By late afternoon, the appraisal had become more than a piece of paper. It was a guide, a mirror, and a reminder. Lily began to articulate her intentions, explaining not just how she would care for the ring, but how she would preserve its story for future generations. Each word reflected careful reasoning and a deep appreciation for the lineage she represented. My son, listening intently, seemed to understand that the ring's true value lay not in its market price but in the ethical and emotional decisions it inspired. The envelope, once a source of tension and potential conflict, had transformed the atmosphere in the house. What could have been a divisive moment became an opportunity for connection, understanding, and subtle reconciliation. It reminded everyone present that inheritance is never merely about claiming what is rightfully yours. It is about stewardship, respect, and the careful balancing of past, present, and future. As the evening settled, Lily carefully folded the appraisal back into the envelope. She placed it in a drawer not out of secrecy, but with deliberate care, signaling that while she now possessed knowledge, she also carried the responsibility to act wisely. I watched her, recognizing the quiet courage it took to assert understanding without arrogance, to hold authority without alienation. In that moment, I knew that she had crossed an invisible threshold from curiosity to insight, from expectation to thoughtful action. The day ended with quiet conversations and reflections, the ring and its appraisal no longer a source of potential conflict, but a catalyst for growth. I felt the weight of the generations, the responsibility of guidance, and the satisfaction of seeing lessons take root. Lily had demonstrated that the truest inheritance is not an object, but the ability to understand, respect, and act with integrity. A lesson far more enduring than any piece of jewelry. The days after Lily received the appraisal passed with a quiet intensity. The house no longer carried the heavy tension of expectation, but something subtler had begun to stir. I noticed glances exchanged between relatives that were tinged with curiosity, respect, and, in some cases, quiet envy. The appraisal had shifted the balance of understanding in the room. It had revealed not only the value of the ring but also the weight of careful decision-making, the ability to act thoughtfully when stakes were high. Lily continued to handle the situation with a measured calm. She asked questions about family history, gently probing older relatives about their experiences with past heirlooms, their own choices, and the lessons learned from both success and error. With each story, she built a tapestry of understanding, connecting the ring's physical history to the emotional and ethical decisions it symbolized. I watched her, proud but also aware that the appraisal had opened a door, one that might lead to unexpected confrontations, challenges, and reckonings. My son seemed caught between admiration and frustration. On one hand, he recognized Lily's maturity and insight, yet on the other, he wrestled with his lingering impulse to claim control. I could see it in his posture, the slight stiffening of his shoulders when Lily questioned him or offered her interpretations of family history. The appraisal had subtly shifted authority, revealing that inheritance was more than possession. It required wisdom, restraint, and integrity. During one conversation, my son asked about a particular note in the appraisal regarding the ring's provenance. His tone was polite, almost deferential, but there was an undercurrent of unease. Lily, patient as ever, explained the context, emphasizing the choices made by past generations and the importance of carrying those lessons forward. The room grew still as everyone absorbed the implications. The ring, once simply a family treasure, had become a mirror reflecting values, priorities, and the quiet power of discernment. I began to notice small changes in the family dynamic. Relatives who had previously been quick to argue or assert dominance now approached discussions more thoughtfully, weighing words and gestures carefully. The appraisal had become a touchstone for behavior, an unspoken reminder that understanding and respect carried more weight than immediate desire. It was remarkable to witness the subtle transformation, the way tension had softened into reflection, and reflection into cautious admiration. Lily, aware of the effect she was having, remained grounded. She never flaunted knowledge or authority. Instead, she invited dialogue, listened attentively, and encouraged others to consider their own perspectives. She asked gentle questions about what past owners might have felt, what mistakes they might have made, and how the decisions embedded in the appraisal could guide future actions. I realized that the envelope, which had once sparked anxiety and impatience, had become a tool for teaching, for fostering growth, and for establishing a sense of ethical continuity. One afternoon, I overheard a conversation between cousins who had previously been at odds over family possessions. They were discussing the appraisal with genuine curiosity, comparing notes and offering insights without rancor. The ring, once a source of potential conflict, had become a catalyst for conversation and understanding. It reminded me that objects carry meaning beyond material value, serving as instruments for connection, reflection, and, occasionally, reconciliation. Even my son's attitude began to shift. I saw him observing Lily closely, noting the clarity of her reasoning and the care with which she approached every question. There was a moment when he offered a suggestion, and instead of asserting authority, he allowed Lily to respond, deferring gracefully. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it signaled a change, a recognition that inheritance demanded respect for process, intellect, and emotional maturity. As the days went on, I began to appreciate the appraisal in a new way. It was more than a document. It was a bridge linking past choices to present actions and future responsibilities. It reminded everyone that stewardship required thought, patience, and the courage to honor both material and moral legacies. Lily's handling of the situation offered a living lesson in how to navigate complex family dynamics with grace and integrity. At night, I reflected on the ripple effects of that single envelope. The appraisal had subtly altered how we related to each other, how we communicated, and how we recognized responsibility. It had transformed potential conflict into dialogue, and curiosity into understanding. More importantly, it had revealed the importance of guiding the next generation with patience, knowledge, and a quiet insistence on doing what was right. I realized that inheritance is never simply a transaction. It is a negotiation of values, a test of character, and a measure of respect. The ring, once a silent witness to family milestones, had now become a symbol of the ethical and emotional depth required to carry forward a legacy. Lily's careful stewardship ensured that this inheritance would not divide us, but instead knit us together, creating a foundation of trust, understanding, and shared responsibility. The day ended with a quiet sense of accomplishment, the house humming softly with conversation, reflection, and newfound awareness. The appraisal, once feared for its potential to spark discord, had done the opposite. It had taught, guided, and united. In witnessing Lily navigate this moment, I felt a profound sense of hope. She had understood not just the monetary value of the ring, but its moral and emotional weight, and in doing so had demonstrated the true meaning of family legacy. Even as calm settled over the household, I could feel the quiet tension lingering beneath the surface. The appraisal had done more than quantify a ring. It had unearthed unspoken expectations, buried resentments, and the subtle hierarchies that had long existed in our family. Lily's careful handling had kept outward conflict at bay, but I knew some truths were yet to surface. That evening, as I watched her organizing the papers from the envelope, I realized that the ring was not merely a piece of jewelry. It had become a key to understanding, a lens through which hidden dynamics would inevitably come to light. My son, previously so preoccupied with asserting control, began asking questions that revealed more about his assumptions than about the ring itself. He wondered aloud why the appraisal had emphasized certain aspects of provenance, why previous owners' decisions were highlighted, and why Lily seemed to grasp the ethical implications almost instinctively. In his voice, I detected a subtle mix of curiosity, frustration, and even guilt. He had always thought inheritance was a matter of entitlement. Now he was beginning to realize it required discernment and conscience. Lily, patient as ever, guided him through the reasoning behind each note and observation. She encouraged him to consider context, to reflect on motives and consequences, and to understand that family legacies are as much about decisions and morality as they are about possessions. I could see the shift happening before my eyes. A man who had long relied on authority alone was now being asked to think, to question, and to acknowledge perspectives he had previously ignored. That night, The conversation drifted toward memories of past conflicts over property, old misunderstandings, and moments where pride had blinded even the wisest among us. Lily's approach was not accusatory. She simply asked questions, pointed out patterns, and gently challenged assumptions. Slowly, stories emerged, stories of lost trust, unspoken sacrifices, and regrets that had been quietly tucked away for decades. Each recollection seemed to breathe life into the papers from the envelope, transforming them from a legal appraisal into a narrative of human experience. I felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. On one hand, the dialogue fostered understanding, a bridge over old rifts. On the other, the more truths were revealed, the more fragile the balance seemed. Secrets that had been safely contained in silence began to rise to the surface, and I sensed that the next few days could either mend bonds or fracture them further. The envelope, which I had once seen as a simple repository of value, had become a catalyst for moral reckoning. The next morning, my daughter-in-law approached me cautiously. Her demeanor was hesitant, her eyes scanning for signs of tension or disapproval. She revealed that, in her own reflection, she had realized the appraisal made her question her assumptions about entitlement and fairness. She confessed that she had, at one point, assumed the ring would pass to her automatically, without considering the deeper implications of family ethics. Hearing her speak, I felt a mix of pride for her honesty and sadness for the misunderstandings that had silently burdened our family. Meanwhile, Lily continued to study the appraisal, highlighting details that might otherwise have been overlooked. She spoke about the lessons embedded in the choices of previous generations, about how every decision, no matter how small, could carry consequences for decades. Her words prompted others to reconsider their own attitudes toward the inheritance and toward each other. The ring, once simply a symbol of material value, had become an emblem of accountability and reflection. During one conversation, my son paused, his expression unreadable. Then he asked a question that caught me off guard. He wanted to know about the possibility of mistakes in the appraisal itself, wondering aloud if we could trust that every detail had been carefully verified. In that moment, I realized that the story was evolving beyond family conflict and curiosity. It was becoming a meditation on truth, responsibility, and the importance of integrity. The appraisal had not only measured value in monetary terms but had opened a door to ethical exploration, forcing us all to consider the principles guiding our decisions. Lily suggested we document our reflections alongside the appraisal, creating a written record not just of the ring's value but of our interpretations, memories, and lessons learned. I saw the wisdom in her idea. This would transform a single object into a living archive of moral guidance. My son hesitated, then nodded slowly, signaling that he was willing to participate in a process that demanded honesty and introspection. It was the first time in years that he had shown such openness, and I felt both surprised and deeply hopeful. Over the following days, the family engaged in quiet but profound conversations. Old wounds were addressed gently, some apologies were offered, and some long-standing assumptions were challenged. The ring, once a point of potential contention, now served as a mirror reflecting our own values, weaknesses, and strengths. Each discussion revealed a little more about our collective identity, about the principles that had guided our ancestors, and about the moral compass that would guide the next generation. I realized that inheritance is never truly about the objects we pass down. It is about the wisdom, judgment, and character embedded within the decisions we make. The appraisal, and the discussions it inspired, had turned our family into a microcosm of reflection, responsibility, and reconciliation. What had begun as a seemingly simple request from my granddaughter had evolved into a journey through memory, ethics, and emotional insight. As I watched Lily carefully place the envelope back into its folder, I felt a sense of resolution beginning to take hold. There were still questions to be answered, and certainly challenges ahead, but the groundwork had been laid. Through patience, dialogue, and reflection, the family was beginning to see that inheritance is as much about conscience as it is about material possession. The ring had revealed more than its worth. It had exposed the heart of our family's moral fabric. The morning air carried a quiet sense of anticipation, almost as if it knew the culmination of our reflections and discussions was near. I watched Lily as she carefully arranged the envelope on the kitchen table, her fingers lingering over its edges, as though it held not only paper but the weight of generations. My granddaughter hovered nearby, curious, her eyes wide with expectation. There was an innocence in her gaze that reminded me why the ring had become so much more than a piece of jewelry. It was a vessel of lessons, a bridge between past mistakes and future understanding. I felt the gravity of the moment, the silent promise that decisions made today would ripple through our family for years to come. My son finally spoke, his voice unsteady but sincere. He admitted that he had underestimated the depth of what the envelope represented. The appraisal had not only measured value in dollars but had laid bare the principles and histories entwined with each choice. He expressed a desire to reconcile, to understand the motivations behind actions he had previously dismissed as trivial or self-serving. Hearing him speak in this way, I realized that the journey we had undertaken was as much about emotional inheritance as it was about material inheritance. The ring had catalyzed a reckoning that could not be undone, and yet it was one that promised growth and connection. Lily handed the envelope to my granddaughter, explaining that it was her turn to engage with its lessons, to see the care and thought embedded in every decision. She gently encouraged her to reflect not only on the ring's history, but on the values it carried, the importance of honesty, patience, and empathy. I noticed my granddaughter's eyes linger on the appraisal, tracing the words as though absorbing their significance. I realized that this moment, simple yet profound, was teaching her about responsibility and awareness in ways that mere instruction never could. As the day progressed, we moved from discussions of past mistakes to visions of future choices. Conversations became more fluid, less defensive, and more introspective. Each family member began acknowledging their own assumptions and misconceptions, and the room was filled with a sense of mutual recognition. The ring, once a symbol of potential conflict, had become a shared focal point for understanding. We laughed softly at memories of misunderstandings, we sighed at recollections of regret, and slowly, the envelope transformed into a symbol of unity rather than contention. I took a moment alone with Lily, grateful for her guidance and patience. I confessed that I had feared the appraisal might create rifts rather than healing. She smiled softly, reminding me that reflection often requires discomfort before clarity. Sometimes, she said, the objects we value teach us what we've overlooked about ourselves. I nodded, recognizing the truth in her words. The ring, the envelope, the appraisal. They were conduits for reflection, catalysts for honesty, and tools for nurturing deeper connections. Later, my son proposed a plan to create a family ledger that recorded not only possessions but also insights, lessons, and intentions for the future. Each entry would carry a story, a reflection, or a guiding principle. The idea was met with quiet approval from everyone present. In that moment, I realized that the ring's value extended far beyond its metal and gemstones. It had inspired a living archive, a continuous dialogue that could guide us through future conflicts and decisions. The day drew to a close, and as the sun set, I found myself reflecting on the journey we had taken. What began as a simple question from a curious child had unfolded into a profound exploration of character, ethics, and familial responsibility. The envelope, once a container of abstract numbers and technical details, had become a repository of wisdom, a mirror reflecting both our flaws and our potential for growth. I felt a profound sense of satisfaction, knowing that the lessons embedded within it would endure beyond our lifetimes. Finally, my granddaughter slipped the ring onto her small finger. There was a reverence in her movements, a recognition that she was holding more than a piece of jewelry. She was carrying forward a legacy of thoughtfulness and conscience. In that moment, I felt the full emotional resonance of what had transpired. The ring was no longer a source of tension or temptation, but a symbol of connection, insight, and the power of intentional guidance. As we sat together in the quiet of the evening, I realized that the disruption introduced by the appraisal had led us through an unexpected but transformative journey. Betrayals, assumptions, and unspoken tensions had given way to dialogue, understanding, and reflection. The family, once fractured by misunderstandings and inherited expectations, was beginning to see the strength that comes from honest communication and thoughtful consideration. The envelope, the ring, and the lessons it contained had done what I had hoped they might. They had fostered reconciliation, moral clarity, and hope for the next generation. In the final moments of the day, as I tucked the ledger and envelope safely away, I felt a quiet gratitude for Lily's wisdom and for the patience of everyone involved. This chapter of our family story had been fraught with tension, but it ended with insight, understanding, and a renewed sense of connection. The journey that began with a simple request from a child had become a testament to the power of reflection, conversation, and shared responsibility. The ring, once an object of desire, was now a symbol of ethical inheritance, and I knew that its lessons would echo through our family for years to come. The evening closed with a sense of calm resolution. I watched my granddaughter examine the appraisal one last time, and I felt certain that she understood the true inheritance she had received. Not just a ring, but a foundation of conscience, empathy, and thoughtful consideration. I leaned back in my chair, heart quietly full, knowing that the family had emerged from this experience stronger, more connected, and more mindful of the legacy we carry forward together. As I finally closed the envelope and watched my granddaughter's eyes widen, I felt a quiet mixture of relief and sorrow. All these years, I'd carried not just memories, but the weight of choices, sacrifices, and the hope that the legacy I left would matter beyond mere things. Life has a way of testing us, not just in the loss or betrayal we face, but in how we hold onto our dignity when others seem ready to dismiss it. I realized that what we leave behind is never just about wealth or possessions. It's about the lessons, the values, and the strength we quietly pass down. In that moment, I felt a kind of peace I hadn't expected, knowing that even small acts of patience and care can ripple across generations. If you've ever wondered what it truly means to protect what matters most, and how fragile trust can shift everything in an instant, there's a story waiting that dives even deeper into these hard truths. It explores a life turned upside down, the hidden faces of family, and the quiet resilience we sometimes discover only when it feels too late. Stick around and see how one man's confrontation with betrayal led him to a revelation that no one saw coming.